Hi everyone, let's get straight to the point. Today I'm going to show you guys how to update your Fujifilm camera using a computer. I know there's a way to use the iPhone or Android app to update the firmware as well, but I don't really like it that way because you have to download the firmware through the phone and then it's transferring the file onto the SD card anyway. So yeah, let's do it with a computer so it's a little bit easier to follow. The first thing you want to do is to check and see if your camera is up to date. You can do that by pressing and holding the display button on the camera and then turn on the camera while holding onto the display button. And you will be brought to this screen right here where it will show you the body firmware and also the lens version of the firmware. And you can update the lens firmware as well via this way, but then we're going to update the body firmware. Because the Fujifilm XS20 has a brand new firmware, so I'm going to demonstrate it using the Fujifilm XS20. So now the body version firmware of my XS20 is 1.20 and the latest one is over 2 point something, but we're going to do it via the computer. So this way I confirm that I have the older firmware, so that's why I can update it using the website firmware. So I'm going to turn off the camera first. The first thing you want to make sure before you update the firmware is to have a fully charged battery inside your camera because you don't want your camera to die during the firmware update. So you just need to turn on your camera and make sure that the camera battery is fully charged. And the second thing you need to have is an SD card that you can format on your camera that you can delete everything, basically delete all the photos and stuff, format it in the camera, and then you can put the new firmware in the SD card and then put it back to the camera. So make sure that you are not using an SD card that you have stuff that you need. So we're going to go into the menu and we'll go into the wrench section of the menu, go to user setting, format, and I'm going to format the SD card inside the camera. Again, make sure you can actually format the SD card first. So after the SD card has been formatted, we are going to take out the SD card and put it into the computer. So now let's jump to the computer and download the firmware. So now we're on our computer and we're going to open up the browser of your computer, no matter if it's a Windows computer or a Mac. We're going to go onto Google and search for Fujifilm, whatever model of your camera is, and then type in firmware. And you'll see that most likely the first option is going to be the Fujifilm-X.com. That's the official Fujifilm website for cameras. So I'm going to click onto this, the XS20 firmware update. Here we have the latest version of the firmware is 2.0.1 for the XS20 and it was last updated in April 2024. So it will tell you what's being updated and it will show you the process of updating the firmware on your camera. So definitely follow this if you want to have like a written out version of the instructions. So as you can see, we have a section where it says firmware update steps. So this is where you want to check the written version of the instructions of how to update your Fujifilm camera. All right, so now we're gonna go all the way to the bottom of the page to download the firmware. As you can see, this version of the XS20 firmware is a huge update with a lot of autofocus related stuff, tracking autofocus. So we're gonna go to the bottom of the page to download the firmware. I'm gonna agree, download, allow. Once the firmware is downloaded on your computer, you can transfer the file onto the directory of the SD card. So now we have the firmware downloaded on the computer and I have transferred it onto the base root of the SD card. So basically there's nothing in the SD card right now. There's no folder, no nothing. That is because we formatted the card. So we're just gonna put it onto the first layer of the folder on the SD card. We're gonna eject the SD card and go back to the camera and finish the process. Once you have the SD card back into the camera, you just need to follow the same process as before by pressing and holding onto the display button and turn on the camera. So you are back onto this firmware update page. I think if I am correct, they have updated this process where you can just go into the camera's menu without holding onto the display button in the future, but this is how I'm gonna update it. So you can see that the firmware is still not yet updated. I'm gonna press OK. And then I can select under firmware update if you want to update the body firmware or the lens firmware. I'm gonna tap or click on to body, and then it's gonna ask you if you want to update the firmware from whatever version you have to the latest one, which is on the SD card. And I'm gonna select OK. And it's gonna warn you to make sure that we do not open the battery cover, don't turn off the camera, make sure that everything is attached, and if there's a lens attached, do not remove it. So I'm gonna press onto the OK button, and it will take some time to update the firmware, and I will finish the video after the firmware is updated. While we're waiting for the firmware to be updated, I just want to point out that I really like this progress bar telling you how long it's going to take for the firmware to update on your camera, because I don't think other camera companies do that. Not Sony last time I updated my camera, but this is really good, so you know that it's actually doing something instead of showing you just a page of like, just please wait. So this is really nice. And it's almost done. So now the firmware update process is done, and I did not turn off the camera yet. I just want to show you that it's going to tell you that it's updated to the version whatever that you put into the SD card. I'm going to turn off the camera right now. And I'm going to do one thing quickly before we just turn on the camera directly. I'm going to press and hold on to the display button and turn on the camera again. Just to check the firmware version, now it's at 2.0.1. And I'm going to quickly check one last thing before we finish the video. I'm going to turn off the camera, turn it back on without holding onto the display button. I'm going to go into the menu and into the range. I just want to make sure that they actually have a new menu item to update the firmware. Yes. Under the range, page 2, the third item is now called firmware update, so I don't think you need to press and hold on to the display button, turning on to the camera, and update the firmware that way. So now we have a better way to do it. It's just a little bit easier. That's it. So this is how you update the firmware of your Fujifilm camera. Let us know if you have any questions in the comment section below. And also, please make sure that, again, you have a fully charged battery and you have an SD card that you can format before you update your camera, because that way you can guarantee that you're not losing the information on your SD card, and also you're not going to break your camera according to Fujifilm. Again, update the firmware at your own risk. We're just showing you how we update our cameras, and we don't want you to damage your camera or lose any information. Make sure you refer back to the Fujifilm website for the proper instructions. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.